Powell. But last but not least, today we have Dr. Tom Palmer. He's the Executive Vice President of the Atlas Network, and he's been very supportive of the Adam Smith Center and Students for Liberty. So let's hear it from Tom Palmer.
You got my PowerPoint up here?
Yes.
What do we do for it? Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. I'm going to talk about some economic theory and some data, but I want to add something that this is very personal for me. Tomorrow I'm going to fly to Bangkok, then I'll take a flight to Ubon Ratchathani, then I'll drive for 3 hours in a truck to our village, where my family lives. The first thing that we built, Barun, was a toilet for our family. They had never had one before. And when we began to build, that was the first thing on the list, was for my mother-in-law to have a toilet and not only the forest. I will wake up Monday morning when I hear the temple sounds and the roosters, and that's my signal to quickly shower while the water is running, because we get about an hour and a half or an hour of water, and it means also filling up the tubs with water to be able to have water for the rest of the day. So poverty questions are not just theoretical for me. They're very much something that I live with my family. Now, when I began first to study economics, we were interested in what causes poverty. That was the big question. What is the cause of poverty? And it's hard to remember now, but back then, people were still focused on the Soviet experience. That was the model that people thought was the model of economic development. And as was discussed earlier, it was entirely capital-driven. The whole model was more capital investment that will industrialize the country. People were starved to death. Peasants were condemned to starvation. All the grain was confiscated and sold abroad to earn foreign currency to buy machines. This was the model of investment. If you want to read the best book on the topic, Francis Puffer's Read Plenty. It's very readable, a very good book on Soviet economic history. Now, looking at that model, it was then adopted elsewhere. This is one of the books I got to read, The Stages of Economic Growth. And this Soviet model was the foundation. Rostow is famous. 5 stages. Everyone was interested in number 3. What led to the takeoff? And it turns out he was reading entirely from the Soviet playbook. Soviet Union was the model to be followed. What was it that took you to the takeoff? It was merely increasing the percentage of GDP that went to investment. That's it. That's the whole model, was go from 5% to 10% investment. And then you took off and you were in the land of mass consumption. Now, the question then, what causes poverty? Lack of investment. We will fill what they call the financing gap, his language, with foreign aid. So that was the model. To avoid the communist approach, foreign aid would fill the financing gap. Well, how successful was that? Here we can look, the line that goes up is the percentage of a government's budget in Africa derived from foreign aid. The other line going down is the economic growth rate. This is pretty stark. It's exactly the opposite of what was predicted, went into negative territory. So this foreign aid was positively destructive. It destroyed incentives for economic growth and really landed people in eminently avoidable poverty. And the foreign aid bears much of the responsibility for this. Now, the dominant question was, again, what causes poverty? I'll just contrast 2 famous economists, John Kenneth Galbraith and Peter Bauer. Galbraith, as he put it, the cause of poverty is poverty. He had been ambassador to India. He looked out his window, he said, from my observations, and he saw people sitting around. And he said, aha, they're lazy. Why are they lazy? Because they're poor. And because they're poor, they're lazy. And as he said, it's just something we have to live with. Bauer had a different approach. When he was interviewed on television by Galbraith, he had 5 minutes, and Galbraith said, tell me, what do you think is the cause of poverty? Bauer said, poverty has no cause. Wealth has causes. And then he stood up and walked out. Very embarrassing for Galbraith. The point was, We don't have to explain poverty. It's the natural condition of humanity. It's wealth that needs to be explained. Now, at Atlas Network, we've asked the question, how can we look at measurable indices and impact on poverty rates? And we commissioned Simeon Jankov, who's a very top-level econometrician, was a developer of the Doing Business Report at the World Bank, to look at the impact of changes in Doing Business Report and Economic Freedom of the World Report, measurable indices, on the poverty headcount and the experience of poverty. What he found was very, very robust, that it is the strongest predictor of people escaping poverty. And to leave poverty behind means not just you had a little bit more money for a short time, it means you're not poor anymore. And your children will not be poor to be able to escape that. What we found very strongly was property rights matter, international freedom to trade internationally matters, and the biggest single one was how easy is it to start a business, to formalize a business. In the Indian case, our partners have worked on the elimination of minimum capital requirements, for example. It's not easy to start a formal business that can invoice people and have legal existence. You need a bank account. That eliminates a huge percentage of the population. And formally, you had to have 111.2% of the previous year's per capita GDP in cash in the bank account. This means poor people effectively cannot open formalized businesses. It's nothing to wealthy people, such a small amount, but to humble poor people, it's a burden that they cannot overcome. Now, that foreign aid model, however, has persisted. How much money was given in official development aid in 2016? This is not emergency assistance, not flood assistance, not earthquake assistance, all of which can be justified for other reasons. This is development assistance, 143 billion US dollars given in official development assistance. And most of this is positively harmful to people. Foreign aid doesn't work. What we are working on, that's been touched on by some of our other speakers, is partners who identify obstacles, local obstacles to people making their lives better. Minimum capital requirements, extremely onerous paperwork requirements to start a new business, difficulties of acquiring title to land, and so on, and working with them, the people who know the reality on the ground, to eliminate those programs. Even when the World Bank comes in and says, you guys need to change your institutions, they don't know what those institutions are. It's local people who know what can be done and what should be done. And we've been focusing much more on this, and these are just some of our successful partners. We did a trial. We put about $2 million US that we went out and raised, all private, no government money, in 29 projects around the world, and 11 of them so far have resulted in positive policy changes, not just changes in opinion. Laws are repealed, policies were eliminated, agencies were downsized, and so on. And that has lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty for a few dollars per person. We think this is a much more effective poverty alleviation strategy than any others that we have run across. Now, I want to talk a little bit about social justice quickly. It's a term that is used quite frequently. It's a disputed term. It's not clear how distinguished from justice, for example. What does the word social add to the idea of justice? Well, people who have asked that hard question and narrowed it down say, well, we want to talk about justice of the overall system as a whole, such that people feel we're committed to this. This is a good society, a just society. We want to be part of that social order and defend it. Many people have concluded from that, I think unjustifiably, that what defines its defensibility is equality, not legal equality, but equality of resources, some sort of egalitarian perspective of wealth. And that's what I want to address very quickly. We saw this in the, this is not working very well, but the Occupy, whoops, this is some incompatibility question here, Wall Street movement, and of course Thomas Piketty's book, which is a remarkable book. It is one of the most boring books I've ever read in my life. It's unbelievably dull, but I'm glad I did it. I was a better person at the end of it, and partly to see all the mistakes in it. Not a single person I've met who has quoted it to me has read it. That's why I was impelled to read it. People kept saying, what about Piketty? What about Piketty? I say, well, what does he say? They say, well, I don't know, something about equality. So I went and read the book. And I don't think he sustains the claims that are made from it. There's a very interesting book, Anti-Piketty, by a group of French economists, which is critical essays, and I wrote the foreword for that. Well, most of the people in that 1% versus 99% movement or followers of Piketty suggest wealth is unequally distributed, and that is by itself inherently unjust and unfair. Well, the philosopher they're more likely to cite, including Piketty, disagrees with them, John Rawls. He discussed inequality, said, look, you can't object to an inequality that's to the advantage of everyone in the society, most notably the least well-off persons. That was his criteria. So it's a pretty strong one, but the interesting question is, what is more likely to satisfy that? What social system, if that's the criterion you establish? A number of people have suggested in recent years, it's free market systems. It's the market. It's liberty of exchange that does that. Most interesting book by John Tomasi on free market fairness that addresses this. And I should point out that real socialists hate Rawls because they think he has conceded too much to liberalism. Jerry Cohen and Brian Barry, who are, how shall I put it, communists, and they really despise Rawls because they said Rawls gives the game away. He opens the door to liberalism. It now becomes an empirical question. And indeed, I think that's right. First point I should mention, I talked about poverty as a natural state of humanity. Angus Maddison, the British economic statistician, looked at poverty to the extent we could measure it for the last 2,000 years, up until roughly the time of his passing. And the question is, what do we need to explain? The long flat part or the hockey stick at the end? What accounts for that? Poverty is the natural state of humanity. It's what you get when you fail to produce wealth. In contrast, wealth is not what you get because you failed to produce poverty. Imagine it. All the day long we tried to make ourselves poor, we failed, and we were rich. It's not how the world works. And we need to focus on what is it that causes wealth? What makes societies wealthy? What accounts for this astonishing difference? Randy Holcomb mentioned one of my favorite economists. Every time I read Morris Schumpeter, I am so impressed by what he got and what he understood. It's innovation that is the key. It's innovation, it's progress. It's not just adding more bricks or having more horses. It's innovating and having new things that no one had imagined before. That is the key to prosperity. As some of the wisest words that were ever written, the problem is usually being visualized how capitalism administers existing structures. The relevant question or problem is how it creates and destroys them. That's the issue. The example I like to give, and I'll be very quick about it, when I was a boy, we had this talk about the anticipations of the future, I thought I wanted to be a typewriter repairman. Because they had a great job, you always had work, people would always need to have their typewriters fixed. Obviously that would not have been a good career choice. There are no typewriter repairmen anymore. Now we have something better than my old typewriter. We have computers. And they do stuff I couldn't have imagined. In the past, I couldn't watch movies on my typewriter. You put the whole movie on the type, nothing happened. If I talked to the typewriter, people would call a therapist. But now I talk to my computer all the time. It's much better. But it did destroy a whole industry. A whole industry doesn't exist anymore because something better replaced it. And frankly, I think all of us are better off as a consequence. Now, we can ask then, well, is this measurable or is this just an opinion? How can we look at this? And the Fraser Institute of Canada does measure the degree of economic freedom that people enjoy in all of the countries around the world, 159, for which there are publicly available data. So Democratic People's Republic of Korea and Libya and Syria and so on are unfortunately not measured. We can review some of the findings. They do rank all the countries of the world. Number 2 up there, behind Hong Kong, is Singapore. It's not a measure of freedom or democracy, it's a measure of how free you are to engage in economic transactions. And on this score, Singapore does pretty well, but could do better. Remember, you're number 2, not number 1 on this score. Well, we can see a number of interesting data. Looking at different quartiles, dividing all the countries up, we find that per capita income, these are the averages over those quartiles, are strongly correlated with the degree of economic freedom. Correlation, causation, not the same. Maybe countries become rich and then say, hey, why don't we have economic freedom? But that's easy to test for. That does not happen. Poor countries adopt more economic freedom and become wealthier. We can look at economic growth. It's pretty robustly correlated. Most people think, oh, it's only about 2.5% difference. That's a lot when you compound interest. I had a conversation at a college campus recently, and someone said, that's not a big deal. You go from 1% to 2% growth. And I explained, I said, it's doubling. It's a lot. It's a big difference when you do that. Particularly when you take time into account. Life expectancy, pretty robust. Now, over on this end, it's been rising rapidly, and that's because medicine and so on is pretty easy to transfer into other countries. But the gap, nonetheless, persists. Political and civil liberties are strongly correlated with economic freedom. This is a complex matter. We don't know exactly in which way the causation goes. You can tell stories where more economic freedom led to more political freedom and civil freedom, and some stories where it went the other way around, like India, which had a robust political freedom before they developed so much economic freedom. Poverty is inversely correlated with economic freedom, quite robust. So if you're going to be poor, much better, or if you're going to be in lower income, much better to be in a free country. This was quite striking. We said the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. They looked. They said, let's look at that lowest group. Take the lowest decile of income. What share of total national income goes to the lowest decile? It's roughly invariant to economic policy. It bounces around a little bit. It's about 2.5%. That was quite striking. But a little bit of a drum roll, if anyone can put that through. All right, there we go. What is not invariant to economic policy is how much money, what their income is. In other words, if you're going to be poor, it's much better to be poor in Switzerland than in Swaziland. To be poor in Swaziland means you don't have potable water, which is a very important issue in much of the world. In fact, that in my family village, that's a big issue. Water, access to water is very important to them. It means you're probably illiterate. You've probably never been more than 50 kilometers from where you were born. And your children are much more likely to die in your arms of simple diseases that no one dies from in wealthy countries. Poor people in Switzerland don't have an iPad. That's a little sad, but not much, to be quite frank. Or another way to think about it, if you think about consumption inequality. So I'm going to take on Monday my mother-in-law to the dentist. This is her second visit to the dentist in her life. The first one I went with her also. The difference between the dental care I get and Mark Zuckerberg's is insignificant. I mean, there's not much difference. I'm sure he has nicer teeth than I do, but not much. The difference between my mother-in-law's dental care, or my father-in-law, who has no teeth at all, and you, is enormous. It's a gigantic gap. Those are the inequalities that I think are more interesting. The inequalities between those people with no dental care and us versus our dental care and Mark Zuckerberg's, which frankly is not that great. Now, very quickly, when we look, I won't go at great length, Thomas Piketty's book had such an impact on the world. Go read it. Go read it. Afterwards, go to your therapist to overcome the desire to kill yourself because it's so boring. But in the book, he makes robust claims. The law, he said, of capitalism, the rate of return on capital is greater than the economic growth, this will lead, as he said, to arbitrary, unsustainable inequalities that radically undermine the meritocratic values on which democratic societies are based. So that's the thesis in the book. It sums up the overall logic of my conclusions. Okay, interesting. Except within a year of its publication in English, he walked back the entire thesis in the American Economic Review. He had gotten so many criticisms, and he said, well, after saying it's the law of capitalism, he ends up saying, well, not really. It's just an interesting insight into changing labor market communities in a few countries for a short period of time, which is an interesting master's thesis, but not a book that should have generated the global movement that it did generate. It's quite striking. Well, finally, we learned something pretty important from development economics. The most important resource is not gold or diamonds or oil or natural gas or land. It's freedom. Thank you very much.